Hi, I am Dr. Kim Sage. Welcome to my YouTube channel and to this series called Wildly Loved, where we are diving into how our childhoods, specifically certain types of complex, complicated childhoods, can truly impact how we function today, in that our brains are often stuck in the important adaptations we had to make to survive those childhoods, except for we're no longer in them, and our brains and our lives sometimes don't necessarily reflect that. So if you're new here, please consider subscribing and checking that little box, and that way you'll get notified when I post new videos. Also, really quickly, please check out my links down below, especially on this week's videos, or really all of them, if you were raised by parents who you believe might meet the criteria for untreated, borderline, or narcissistic. Even histrionic type presentations we're talking about in the news this last week, but really parents who were what I often call eggshell parents, who were conditional, highly conditional parents, parents where you sort of never knew what you were going to get and or never really got your emotional needs met, and it was very much a pattern. And it could be for many different reasons, but I have some courses on how to really understand yourself and your life if you were raised by parents with borderline or narcissism, or who fit the criteria of being emotionally just really immature, unpredictable, and things of that nature. A course on how to identify what happened to you in childhood, and also a course on learning to reparent and love on and heal your inner child, what I truly believe is remothering the energy of what it means to be mothered. So please check those out. Okay, I really wasn't sure where to go with this week's videos, and I just felt really called to myself to talk about these topics, which are about what it looks and feels like to have parents that were eggshell, emotionally unsafe, untreated, borderline, or narcissistic type parents, and how that impacts us, how that sits and creates this trauma brain we're talking about. Because the heart of so much of this is that what happens to us in childhood as a result of who our caregivers are and how they are dealing with life and what life gives them and their nervous systems and their own childhoods, that generational pattern, if they're breaking it or not, all of that is what I'm talking about when I'm talking about this trauma brain for most of us. And so I really wanted to talk this week about what it looks and feels like to have more narcissistically or borderline inclined parents who were really, not in active treatment, didn't know what they had going on, and things of that nature. And in fact, I just realized my books are sitting out, but I do want to share with you some of the books I'm going to be using this week and referencing. So this book called Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents. This book called Will I Ever Be Good Enough, which is about having a narcissistic mother. It's written for daughters, but I think it's helpful for really anyone. This book called Stop Caretaking the Borderline or Narcissist, How to End the Drama and Get On with Life. These are all on my website too, on drkimsage.com. And this book, which is the book that really, to be honest, changed my entire understanding of my childhood, called Understanding the Borderline Mother, Helping Her Children Transcend the Intense, Unpredictable, and Volatile Relationship. Now, that being said, though, with regard to borderline, I want to make sure we're not adding additional stigma, but also honoring the children who are victims of untreated parents who struggle. And so this book has some really strong descriptions and language of borderline. And I want you to remember, if you're a younger person watching this channel, that in my generation and beyond, and even in psychology, in terms of school, many of us were raised to believe that the borderline only looked like the classic one, actually the classic picture that's being discussed in the news in the last few weeks. But there are many different variations of borderline, from the high end to the very clinical population that's very at risk to themselves and their own internal world, to those who never have a thought about not being here, but struggle with consistency and validation of children, and often at the end of the day, because of their own struggles, everything goes back to them. And as a child, you learn that you are not the center, they are the center, and you must rotate around them. And so I'm going to talk a lot about this book in the next few days, because there's an idea here, the caretaking, that there's a very specific pattern that happens as a result of being raised by a borderline or narcissistic parent. And that because of, although they're different, many of the defense mechanisms they use are similar, number one. And we can see combinations and layering up to a 40% sometimes combination of narcissism on top of borderline. And at the core, what we're talking about is love that doesn't feel attuned and mirroring and generally consistent. And so that might come from a very classic narcissist who it's always about them and it's very conditional, and then they rage and they're scary, or they have internalized rage. It might come from, and their tendency to blame you, right? To project onto you, to ask you to hold the ugly feelings they feel. In terms of splitting, we see that in borderline and narcissist, which is being highly devalued. You're the worst person ever, to being highly valued and idealized. Both of them for different reasons in terms of BPD and NPD, but the core is that you are good or bad. And as I've said in so many videos, I truly believe that the wounded core of us is that when you have a parent who you have to rotate around their feelings, their time, their money, their story, their life, their complicated relationships, you at the heart never really feel that you matter. And it manifests in a life where you don't trust people, you feel that you need to isolate, or that people will always leave you as well. You might split in terms of that you see yourself as all good or all bad, or everything that happens to you is all good or all bad. These things can impact us. And there's also emerging research that borderline has some genetic components, and that's still being explored, but that it seems to be more closely found in the closer you are in the family system. And so if that's the case, that also creates, I believe, a chance for us to talk more openly about it, to get diagnoses and treatment. And today, narcissism, not so much, because most narcissists don't go to therapy, but for borderline, there are very, very many treatments. And yes, I know they're not always accessible or affordable, but there really are some really profound treatments that can change a person's life. And therefore, not just their life, but their children's lives and their partner's lives and their entire family system. And so that's why I'm so passionate about it. As I've said, I was raised by a mother who has borderline, and I was in my late 40s before I finally truly realized it. And it was this book that helped me see it. So if you're not sure and you're saying, oh, I thought it was narcissism, this book can be very helpful in creating and characterizing what it feels like if you had a parent who struggled. I'm sorry, this is a long intro, I know it is, but I want to set that up that you understand what I'm talking about and why. So this whole week we're going to talk about the impacts on us, on how it creates these caretaking qualities, not just the kind where you just go out and take care of everyone else, but how you deal with yourself in the world and what that looks like. So I wanted to start today's video by just explaining what it really looks like when you have a caregiver who struggles with these issues. And so what you're going to see are things like a lack of predictability, walking on eggshells, not knowing what you're going to get. You can often see major issues with rage and anger. That goes for both NPD and BPD, but where it almost comes out of nowhere. Or you might see a lot of what feels like conditionality. You're only loved when you're reflecting back their worth, their light, their accomplishments, their success. We can see a lot of enmeshment where there's not a good separation between you and the parent, and you somehow feel like you're an extension of them emotionally and otherwise. We can see both of them parentify children where you act in the parent role and you console them, you comfort them, you talk to them about their problems with their other partner or your other parent. You might take care of your other siblings, right? You're parentified. You're acting as a parent while you are still in childhood. And yes, even if you're an adolescent, you're still in childhood. Even though you can be a teenager and understand your parents' problems, it's not healthy for you to always be handed them and be, in a role where you feel responsible for helping them fix and solve and deal with them. We can see kids, I've seen many adult children who navigate parents' fights, like sit down at the table and like you're going to make up and you're going to own your part, like as a teenager or child. These parents have a very low stress tolerance, so they can't handle a lot, right? It doesn't take much to kind of throw them out of their window of tolerance. They're easily triggered and upset. We often see very poor boundaries, not good at having them, not good at setting them, not good at respecting them. As I said earlier, a lot of anger issues for both, although they can also be more quiet or internalized, like repressed anger for both borderline or narcissism, or some, just combination, or some traits where there can be a physical aggression and threats. We can see acts of self-injury. But, at the core, it's like when you think about your classic, like borderline, for example, parent who struggles, it's going to be like, in your body, you just feel anxiety all of the time. And when you're in it, it's because they are angry. It feels scary and oftentimes out of nowhere, and really intense when it's happening. And then later they might apologize or be super loving. And so that's why I always say, I think if you have a parent who's more borderline, it is the most difficult to heal from, because it's not always bad. It's not always bad. And you do get what feels like good love, although it doesn't make up for the hurtful, the bad love. And so that's where it gets difficult. And these are, by the way, kids who will say, adult children saying, but I can't leave them. They struggle, or they've done so much for me. But meanwhile, they are taking so much abuse, so much toxicity, so much wounding, so much hurt. They can be overly rigid or overly flexible, where there's not a real good, same thing, internal boundary. Certainly sense of self issues where they're not really sure who that is, and or there's a very strong sense of self, like a narcissist who's very clear on what seems to be clear on who they are and seems really confident or really boastful or arrogant. You're going to see chronic relational instability with both of them. They just have a hard time having consistently reciprocal, healthy relationships. You might see what kind of feels like a fake persona, where what the outside world gets and what you get at home are not the same thing, and you're like, everyone doesn't understand it. And or everyone in the family, I'm talking fast, slow down. And or everyone in the family kind of knows the drill and the deal, but they just make it okay. And these are kids who, your aunt loses her mind sometimes, and I know she throws things and breaks things, but she loves you. Meanwhile, you're still growing up going, yeah, but that's a chaotic place to live. And so you can see this mismatch between what is happening in the outside world and or this sort of collusion, this colluding. The family just all kind of like looks the other way or keeps blinders on. You can see very poor communication skills, like name calling, verbal abuse, the silent treatment, shaming, things like that. You will certainly see a neglect of your true emotional needs, because if they're remaining untreated, they don't have the ability to truly and consistently make it about you. So it can feel like emotional absence. It can certainly be emotional neglect because of their own issues or because of their lives or however they see things. We can see addiction issues, a parent being overly controlling and that they won't let you grow up and develop. We certainly see lying for different reasons. Both types can lie to you and you'll catch them later. It feels like, of course, it can be gaslighting behaviors that I didn't say that and that wasn't true. And I will say in some cases for borderline, when they get really upset, they can dissociate from what's happening. And so they actually don't remember that they said certain things to you. It doesn't mean that that's okay or always true, but it can happen. And certainly with a narcissist, if they're angry at you and they say things and that doesn't align with how they see themselves later, they'll say, I didn't say that, you're crazy. And we can certainly see at the core trauma bonding, where you're in this relationship, it is your parent, it's so good and so bad, and you can't seem to get out of it. There's this sort of very unhealthy relationship happening, and it's very common, I think, and mostly in more borderline families, because like I said, when it's good, it can seem so good and you feel responsible, and they maybe raised you to feel responsible for them, and so it feels like you're a bad person if you try to set boundaries or protect yourself, and then they don't seem to or tend to respond to that well, and then you feel bad about yourself. Oh, I'm being the bad child. They had a bad childhood too. It's like, yeah, but so did you. But we don't see that, and we just get stuck in these very toxic patterns with them. And we can love them so much and then be so angry and hate them. And I would say if you have very strong love and very strong hate when you were in the relationship, not if you've gone no contact or you've done surface work, there's a very good chance your parent may have a more, at least the characteristics or trait of borderline. So I would encourage you to do more research and more work. And that's always the case for me, that with all of these videos, that everything I talk about is just meant to introduce you to topics. But please know this is not, of course, not therapy, but I want to give you so much information so you can go and get support and read books and see therapists and watch podcasts or listen to podcasts and get more clear about your healing work. So the bottom line is that all of this, if this is what your childhood looked like, how does that show up in your trauma brain? It shows up in your inability at times to regulate your own body, to be extremely anxious or extremely collapsed and shut down, or to both. It tends to make you feel unsafe in relationships, but also long for them. So you can have that kind of, anxious and avoidant behavior. It makes trusting people incredibly difficult at the core, because if your own parent can betray you that way as a parent, betray meaning not really make life about you, then how could anyone else, right? We learn what love looks like and what we're supposed to expect in relationships through our childhoods and our caregiving. And so then we start acting out these trauma issues, right? Where we get easily dysregulated, or we live in our sort of shut down space, or there's, a flood of emotional flashbacks, or we go out and repeat these unhealthy patterns and choose unhealthy partners. And we think we're going to, heal that trauma brain, but we actually reinforce the dynamic. And so I want you to get really clear on how this setup I just described, if this is you or mostly you, how that is really not your fault, and that sets you up to make the choices and to get stuck living in the child's world. Because as I just described, if that was your childhood, and it certainly was my childhood, it's really hard to turn that off. And so for many of us, maybe we don't repeat that, but we go the opposite, right? We become very appropriate and very conflict avoidant, and any conflict is triggering. But especially if you have other interactions with other people in your family who are intense or more borderline, or this parent, I describe it as feeling like I'm going to explode and I'm trapped. And it's very clear the difference between self-advocacy now and when I'm interacting with somebody who is actually behaving in that similar pattern. So I've really worked in my life to not have that, but you can't always avoid it. And so, but in the early days, any self-advocacy or conflict felt like the child trapped with the raging parent, right? The eggshell parents. And so I really want to talk this week about this concept, about how these childhoods set us up. And that is why I made the courses I spent almost a year on. Because I truly believe, especially with the borderline parent, there are so many people that don't know that actually that is what it is. And that is what makes it so complex and so hurtful and so hard to heal. Because that child sometimes got their needs met and oftentimes didn't. Was never fully safe, but would take kind of anything for safety, and then is so easily triggered by the world. And that makes our relationships, our parenting, it makes everything really difficult. When your internal map says chaos, chaos, people aren't safe, people will leave you, they'll betray you, you don't get a voice, you don't get to speak up for yourself, just take it. Or maybe you blow because that's what you saw your parents do, and then you feel bad. Or any kind of anger feels like horrifically unsettling inside, like you're not entitled to your own emotions because there was no space for them. So that is today's video. We're going to spend the rest of the week, as I said, talking about it. Tomorrow's video will be about how the borderline and narcissistic parents tend to create this caretaker role for you. And then we'll talk about how it impacts you, but sort of why it happens and how it happens, and then what kind of to understand about yourself. That will be the rest of this week. So thanks for watching. Please stay safe and well, and I will see you tomorrow. Bye, guys.